Professor Eunan O'Halpin, Chair of Contemporary Irish History at Trinity, thanks a million for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Patrick.
Can we talk about the Irish War of Independence? Because for so many years that was seen as a glorious period in Irish history, but in more recent years there's been a lot of controversies that have built up around things like, for example, the Kilmichael ambush.
Yeah, there have been a lot of controversy in the last 20, 30 years. I think that's an inevitable product of two things. One is the passage of time, and the other is the increasing availability of records relating to the period, right? And I think a lot of the controversies, for example, about the Kilmichael ambush, arise to some extent because records emerge which appear to contradict what was taken to be a very straightforward, heroic narrative. Now, when you go into it more deeply, in the case of Kilmichael, you find that there were local arguments almost from the very start about the conduct of the ambush and what actually happened. These weren't arguments about the morality of wiping out or almost wiping out an enemy patrol. They were about who was claiming the credit and who was left out of the story. So Kilmichael is one famous example, but there are many cases within the Irish War of Independence where there are disputes, and where those disputes, when the records appear, very often they appear to contradict. Sometimes, in the case of my grandfather, in another instance where a clergyman was shot, they go against the family narrative. In the family narrative of my father's father, he commanded an IRA unit which accidentally shot a clergyman thinking him to be a policeman. They were relieved in the family story that he was wounded but not killed. I got the records recently. They actually haven't been released yet of the man who fired the shot. And when he was asked, it's a verbatim interview with him, when he was asked what happened to the clergyman, he said, well, he recovered from the wounds, but he died 2 years later as a result. Now, that kind of evidence completely contradicts my own family narrative in the case of a controversial killing. And that's going to increase rather than decrease in Ireland, as in other countries, as more material becomes available.
And do you think that will make people view the War of Independence differently?
Well, I think it should. I think in any conflict, where you move away from the idea of black and white, of simple good and simple bad. The case of the Irish War of Independence is also, if you like, an intercommunal conflict. If you look at what happens in what becomes, in 1921, the north of Ireland, most of the violence there is not violence directed against the British state. It's violence directed primarily against the Catholic minority and also carried out by the Catholic minority on the Protestant majority. So it's a much more intercommunal kind of fight, but it's part of the larger struggle. And it's an oversimplification to see the Irish War of Independence simply as a struggle against British rule.
You have a number of family relatives who fought in the conflict. Your great uncle was Kevin Barry, who we've talked about on the course, and he became one of the great icons of the War of Independence. He
did, and he's an interesting story. He was a medical student, he'd been Jesuit educated, so he's a middle-class boy, and so all sorts of people speak up for him. Now, Kevin Barry himself refused to take part in his court-martial. He said, you can convict me if you like, but I don't recognise the court. He, in a sense, was quite happy to die. He wasn't a deeply Catholic or pious figure. He wasn't going off to be a martyr or anything like that. I think the most admirable thing about him is the way he carries himself in British records as well as Irish narrative. In the hours before his death, he mainly spent his time talking sport with the warders, not talking about God or, saying his last confession over and over again. But the contrast for Kevin Barry in my family story is my mother's other uncle, Paddy Maloney, who was killed in a gunfight outside Tipperary town, and no one's ever heard of him, because my grandmother wasn't interested in her dead brother-in-law because he wasn't famous. And so she told us all the time about her dead brother Kevin, and my siblings never even heard of their other dead great uncle Paddy, who died in a straight-up gunfight with the police. And his story is equally as interesting. And in any Irish family, be they the descendants of policemen or soldiers or of civilians as much as of Republicans, there's all these untold stories and unexplained dimensions of family history. And again, the records are terribly helpful here. I recently wrote a piece in the Irish Times about the man regarded as the greatest Taoiseach or Prime Minister Ireland's had since independence, Sean Lemasters. I discovered in contemporary records that Lemasters had accidentally shot his 2-year-old brother just before the Easter Rising and killed him. Now, members of Lemasters' own family, his own grandchildren, didn't know this. right? It was in the records, but it had been kept out of the family story because it was a very painful private matter. It was nothing to do with politics. But nevertheless, it's relevant to any biography or Lemass or anyone trying to understand why Lemass, even though he fought in the War of Independence, fought in the Civil War on the anti-treaty side, he would have nothing to do with recriminations about who killed who or anything like that. And so this story, even though in some ways it's a private family tragedy, is also properly part of the public record. But in order to find it, we have to look at the records. And we in Ireland, as in the United States or elsewhere, are sometimes very reluctant systematically to look at what the state holds and what families hold about our own families' histories, sometimes for fear of what we'll find.
Tell us a little bit more about Lemass. You say that he didn't want to carry forward after the Civil War any bitterness or recriminations. During the Civil War, wasn't his brother Noel, they were on the anti-treaty side, his brother Noel was taken out and executed?
Yeah, his brother really after the Civil War was picked up by, we'd regard them almost as the government Gestapo. He was taken out to the Dublin mountains, he was beaten up and shot to death and his body was buried. Some months later it was found and Noel Lemass is it's in a very beautiful setting where his body was found up in the Dublin mountains. There's a commemorative cross there now, and that was always the point at which Lemass's family went to commemorate him. And so they didn't know, his grandson was telling me this, he had always gone to commemorate his dead great uncle up in the Dublin mountains. He never went to the graveyard where his dead uncle was buried beside his other dead uncle of whom he had never heard, the 2-year-old whom Sean Lemass's grandfather had accidentally shot. So families have partial histories just as states do, and just as movements like the Republican movement or the Unionist movement in Ireland does as well.
When you look at the outbreak of the Civil War, which proved to be such a divisive event in Irish history, can you point the blame? Well, first of all, can you point the blame at De Valera for not going to London to negotiate the treaty? Can you point the blame at De Valera for not accepting the treaty?
I think that had De Valera accepted the treaty as a fait accompli, having sent people over, after all, as plenipotentiaries, which means they have full powers, I think that he would have been able to carry more of his people with him. Right, I think there would still have been a split, and that somebody, perhaps now somebody we barely think of, would have emerged as the political leader of an anti-treaty grouping. Whether that would have led to a civil war, we don't know. But underlying all of this is the real problem, in a sense, in the narrative of 20th century Irish history, which is that Northern Ireland, the separate state of Northern Ireland, was already in existence because of British legislation in 1920. And although there was real grounds for believing that the borders of Northern Ireland might change by negotiation as part of the treaty process, there was no hope by then that the Unionist majority, Protestant, if you like, majority in North East Ireland were ever going to happily come into an independent Ireland. And the Civil War or not, that wasn't going to happen.
W.T. Cosgrave said it was like playing a big match and leaving your best player on the bench. When you think about Lloyd George, the Welsh wizard, and Churchill and Birkenhead and all of those very experienced negotiators being up against, Griffith, Collins, people who really had none of this experience, you think De Valera might have been able to make a difference in those negotiations? Well,
I think he might have been, but there were particular tactical errors made, particularly by Arthur Griffith, which would go way beyond ineptitude. Griffith in agreeing in a private conversation with the British and giving them a written undertaking not to break on Ulster and so on. This is, in negotiation terms, this is ineptitude of a high order, unless Griffith was playing for high stakes, unless Griffith thought that he could deliver a deal, an Anglo-Irish deal that would leave him in charge. He may have been more ambitious than we think. He may have thought, I'll square it with the British, we'll get it through at home, and I'll be the great man. I mean, I think because De Valera, who wasn't at the negotiations, dominates Irish narratives of the negotiations, that doesn't really make sense. You have to look at the people who were there as well as the people who weren't.
Irish politics then divided along Civil War lines for decades afterwards. But now looking back on it, it seems ridiculous that anyone would have opposed the treaty. Is it the case that the pro-treaty side won the argument in history?
Well, we say Irish politics divided in Civil War lines. There was always a substantial minority who didn't really vote on Civil War lines, whether they voted Labour, whether they voted for independence, whether they voted essentially for small sort of Southern Unionists, parties or whatever. So we have to be careful about that. Secondly, we really can't be sure of what would have happened had more of the if you like, the revolutionary elite accepted the treaty. You have to realise that Britain had her own imperial defence concerns and so on. She had her own strategic concerns. She had her own concerns about empire. And I'm primarily a British historian. My PhD was on Britain, interwar Britain. And I can assure you that the British, as elsewhere in the world, absolutely redefine what they say, any agreement they've done with any country or former colony, just as the French do, just as whoever do. I was talking to a very recent Irish Attorney General who had long experience to negotiate with the British, and he just shook his head and he said that the problem with the British is you'll say something and they'll say, well, that's agreed then. You know? Because Britain has her own national interests, and her national interests shift. At the time, in 1921, Britain's strategic defence was based on the concept of imperial defence. Of Ireland was important in terms of what became controversial in the Second World War, the ports, not for defending the Atlantic and the link with the United States, which was actually what the First World War showed what mattered, but for defending the imperial lines of communication to the British Empire. And the ports were seen in 1921 as being important, not to defend Britain against Germany, because Germany was a goner, but primarily to defend Britain against France, because you couldn't trust the French. They're a dodgy lot.
What's your view on the commemoration of historical events? Is there a danger that it can simplify the narrative and that it can remove a lot of the complexities that you've been talking about here?
I think commemoration does remove a lot of the complexities and overlooks them, and it oversimplifies, it over-dramatises, and you wear a black hat or a white hat and all that kind of thing. I attended a commemoration on Saturday of the Dublin lockout of 1913, which is a prime example. The Army No. 1 band was there, the President was there, the Irish flag was there, and yet the 1913 lockout was a British Labour dispute, as its leading historian keeps pointing out. It was nothing to do with nationalism whatsoever, right? Ireland was part of the United Kingdom. Nobody was making an argument for Irish independence or even for Home Rule. They were in a dispute with an employer in a typical provincial British city. But yet it has become part of the national narrative. It's the Labour bit of the decade of commemoration that we've now embarked on. So, but nevertheless, out of that, people will reflect. Some people will become more interested, some people will dig more deeply, some people will come up with one argument, some people will come up with another. So I think we'll deepen our knowledge out of commemoration. There was a lot of criticism in Ireland in 1998, the bicentennial of the 1798 rebellion, which some people felt leading historians almost sneered at, because you had a lot of reenactments, so you have people going around dressed like pikemen, or so they think, in red coats, and then they have to dress up their women as well, and there's all this kind of slightly folksy approach. But I'm sure that the study and the comprehension of that rebellion has been deepened as a result of public engagement with it, however oversimplified, rather than if we had simply said, oh, us academics, we write some footnotes about this, because it's too dangerous to write anything that the public might read.
And yet people get very upset if you challenge some of the things that they have grown up as articles of faith. So if you criticise the 1916 Rising for being undemocratic, or if you expose some of the atrocities on the revolutionary side during the War of Independence, that kind of strikes at people's certainties.
Well, I think it does, but that's life. I can't help it. By chance, I'm one of the few people, probably with all four of my grandparents were involved, actively involved in the Irish War of Independence. Three of my grandparents spent a lot of time in jail, and so on and so on. But it's too bad if some of the stories I learnt from my grandparents or about my grandparents, if I encounter different versions of them, if I encounter in particular records which challenge, in the case of my father's father, the accepted happy story of not killing a clergyman. It turns out the man who shot him says, yeah, we did kill him, and he's saying, well, I got him, right? And so on. But this can't be helped. Within families, it doesn't have to be about politics or whatever. There's going to be contested stories of what happened to Auntie Mary's cake, or Uncle Joe's teapot when he died, and that was meant to go to you, Patrick, in fact, whereas Eunan took it, because he said Uncle Joe would always wanted me to have it. So there's a contested versions of every narrative, not just in the public, but in the private sphere, and history is no different, nor should it be.
And just going back finally to your great uncle, Kevin Barry, he was reinterred from Mountjoy Prison and buried in Glasnevin Cemetery. I think it was 2001. I think you were one of the people who carried that.
That's right. They were sort of grandnephews from different ends of the family, most of whom I'd never met because the family, in a sense, is quite dispersed. And it was very interesting and very moving. We had one rehearsal with an empty coffin. On the day, what they did, because there weren't many remains, they took a coffin's worth of earth from roughly the space where each body they thought lay. Now, as it happened, they had a map which turned out to be accurate as to where the different bodies were. So this thing weighed an absolute, I've carried coffins, but this was like, it just weighed an absolute ton. So you had this solemn moment where, and we were different heights, where you've practiced once before, and I was the front on the right. So this thing, and so you're moving on a slippery plastic imitation grass thing. It was actually, it was so nerve-wracking carrying it that you forgot even the nature of the occasion. You just kept offering prayers to the Lord, please don't let me slip.
And presumably you were also maybe not thinking as an historian on that day, you were thinking as a proud family member.
Well, to some extent, but I did write a piece in the paper the weekend before, saying I would rather that I carried it, and insofar as I make political arguments, but I see the nature of the Irish state being as opposed to being carried by. I'd seen a parade the previous week of young people in black trousers, white shirts and black berets and black gloves, and this was a Sinn Féin parade. They themselves obviously were ignorant of history, and they wouldn't have dressed so very like European fascists. But I would rather that the Irish state, which I think is a legitimate state, that it should take responsibility for people who died fighting for Irish independence than that it should be left to, if you like, people who in 2001 barely recognised the legitimacy of the state.
Professor Eunan O'Halpin, Chair of Contemporary Irish History at Trinity, thanks a million for joining us.
Thank you, Patrick.